And the reason I think it's so important is that we're a storytelling species. The human beings are storytellers. That's what sets us apart from other animals. And this is how we understand the world. It's how we understand ourselves. It's how we understand our place, our origin, is through story.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Dean Nelson, and we're going to be discussing his book, Talk to Me: How to Ask Better Questions, Get Better Answers, and Interview Anyone Like a Pro. Dean, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shaun. It's an honor to be with you today.
Well, let's start our interview with what we might call a bit of the Dean Nelson origin story and take a look at what you might call your windy path to becoming a journalist. I see that you, like me, are a Minnesota native. You're a fan of hockey. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Minnesota.
I actually loved growing up in Minnesota. I live in San Diego now, and people talk about it like, aren't I lucky that I get to live in San Diego, escaping that Siberian kind of experience. And I don't view it that way. I am very grateful for my time in Minnesota, and if the situation were right, I would still move back there. I'm not sure my wife would, but I would definitely move back there. There's so much life there. It's a vibrant culture, a lot of creativity going on there. Come on, an area that produced Bob Dylan and Prince. Are you kidding me? That's the place you want to be from.
Yeah, well, and it's funny you said kind of that Siberia sort of state. I just think through the years, a number of people I've talked to, who, authors or people we were bringing into Minnesota, and people would legitimately ask, so when I fly into Minneapolis, is it like a covered walkway from the plane into the terminal? Because there are some people who think Minnesota is like going to some weird remote part of Alaska. And it's like, no, Minneapolis, It's like a legit international airport. There is a covered walkway. Don't worry.
They bring you from the plane to the terminal by dog sled.
Yes.
Up there.
Yes.
No, it's actually in a developed country up there. So no, they know how to deal with it. Which much of the world, much of the country does not know how to deal with weather. Right. Minnesotans know how to deal with it. There's a clarity to it that I find refreshing.
So in prepping for the interview, I've listened to a number of different podcasts. So I got a bit of your background that's not included in the book, and I'm super curious about your windy path, the journey you took to get to becoming a journalist. There was a time in your life where you actually worked on ambulances, you worked in the ER, and you were actually pre-med for a time in college. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that time of your life. Like, what drew you into doing that sort of work and thinking you were going to become a doctor?
It's still sort of a mystery to me how I had all of these desires of being a doctor, and that was where all my interest was. My first jobs in high school were in ERs as an orderly. I was drawn to the adrenaline. I was drawn to helping people. I was drawn to just the scenario of the seriousness of your decisions that you have to make. And I was just drawn to that. I mean, even Christmas presents when I was a kid, I was asking for, the usual stuff anybody would ask for, but I also wanted that dissecting kit or stethoscope or whatever. I never did get those defibrillating paddles that I asked for year after year, but that may be for the best. I was even named after a doctor that my family knew. So it was like, this was my destiny. And so I was pre-med in college, and the first couple of years just totally got into it. And then it was my junior year when I realized I was spending every afternoon in a lab, every evening in a lab. My whole life was just not doing stuff that I thought was as interesting. And I had kind of the first of my existential crises there, probably as a junior. It was while I was trying to get ready for the MCATs, the medical college admission tests, that I just had this thought of, is this how I want to spend the next 10 years of my education, just studying and being in labs and taking exams? And I had just sort of a meltdown right then. So, yeah, I realized then it's not going to be this. The thing I had been preparing for my entire life was not going to be this.
I think we all have moments like that throughout life as we choose different paths. Now I'm curious to find out, how did you go from that to working for an urban church in Detroit? That seems like an interesting left turn.
Yeah, I'm still mystified by all of it. But my advisor in college said that, okay, I could still graduate on time if I, just took a major in whatever I had the next most units in. And it turned out to be literature, which that should have been a clue to me that all of the choices that I was making outside of the sciences were about reading and writing. So I still graduated with a literature degree, but when you have a literature degree, I don't know what kind of marketable skills you actually have. But I ended up getting hired because I was actually a pretty decent writer at the time, given my lack of professional experience. And I got hired by this church that had seen some of the things that I had written performed, some one-act plays and things like that. So this urban church, this is back in the 70s. And so you got to remember, this is the Jesus movement, and there were a lot of coffee house ministries and things. And this church owned a coffee house right in the middle of Detroit where they brought in bands and creative types and poets and all of that, with the idea that people would find Christ just coming off the street here, and then maybe those folks would feed into that larger church. So they hired me to run that coffee house. But keep in mind, I had no management experience. I had no business experience. I was not prepared theologically in any way. I was just kind of a halfway decent writer and had some creative ideas on how to put on good programs. And so once again, I was miserable and lost and just felt like, what am I doing? Just what am I doing? I spent 3 years just sort of walking around in circles in Detroit going, what am I doing? So yeah, you're right. It was nonlinear then, and it seems just as nonlinear as I describe it.
And you mentioned earlier that by this time you were a pretty good writer, regardless of how much formal training you'd had. I'm curious to hear, when did writing emerge as a passion? Was this something you were pursuing, at least to some degree, like in elementary school or junior high or high school, or whether you realized it or not at the time? When do you see that kind of passion for writing and literature begin to start for you?
That's a really good question, because as I look back on it, one of the threads from even back to childhood was that I was always writing. I was always writing a story, whether it was fiction or whether it was satire. I loved Mad Magazine and now more recently something like The Onion or something like that. I just loved that stuff. And so I just found myself telling stories. And when I was in college, I was part of a group that put together an underground newspaper that was just all satire. It was 100% fiction, but it was great fun. And I'm confessing this now 40 years later. So I think the statute of limitations on that underground newspaper has finally expired. But all of this, I was still writing. And I'll tell you, like in any good story, there's an inciting incident in my sort of career story. And that was, I had an uncle who was a Bible scholar and archaeologist. He taught at Yale Divinity School, all of this stuff. But he lived in retirement, not too far from you, in Indiana. And he finally summoned my wife and me to his house in Indiana and sat me down, and we just had one of those kind of come to Jesus conversations where he just said, how long are you going to do this Detroit thing? What's your plan? And I didn't have a plan. I didn't know people had plans. Once I lost the medical school idea, I had no plan. And so he said, what's your plan? I was just kind of lost. Seriously, Shaun, I was just lost. He saw this, and finally he just said, well, let me ask you a different question. What are you good at? And so this was where everything changed. He asked me, what am I good at? And the first thing came out of my mouth was, I'm a pretty good writer. And he said, what evidence do you have of that? I said, I don't have any evidence. I just think I am. I do it a lot, and, I make people laugh. And he said, how about we get you developed as a writer? So we just brainstormed a little and talked about, well, you could become a journalist and they'd pay you to write. So I thought, well, that sounded pretty good. I'd never considered that. So I started looking into journalism schools and saw that there was a sort of a hierarchy of journalism schools. So I started at the top, the University of Missouri's journalism school. Illinois' got a good one too, but I just thought, well, let's see if I can hit in that league. And I got into Missouri right away. And so got a journalism degree, a master's degree in journalism. And it's like, oh, this is what I want to be doing. I felt that way the first day of class.
In some ways we could say, and all the rest is history. But in terms of making that leap from, it sounds like you did your undergrad, you did your master's degree. What was that balance of that season of moving into be formerly working as a journalist? And then at what point did you also get into teaching, or were both kind of always a part of your journey all the way through?
I'd never really considered academia as a possibility. I loved doing journalism. I still do. And I still consider myself a journalist. When I stopped this morning working on a story to talk to you, I'm a journalist. Now, for me, it's the combination of teaching and writing that I find really, really energizing, because I can go from working on a story, maybe on the U.S.-Mexico border, and then go into class and say, hey, I got to tell you about this interview I just had with this Border Patrol officer. And that kind of energizes my teaching as well. Journalism is one of those things where you can't just rest on something you did 5 or 10 years ago. It's got to be something you're working on now. So it's kind of the combination of both. So while I was working as a business reporter in Minneapolis, this school from San Diego that I knew of, but I'd never been to, contacted me and said, hey, we're starting a journalism program. We've looked at your background. You have a master's degree in journalism from a really good school. You have a literature degree from a Nazarene school. This is a Nazarene school. You kind of know our world. Will you help us develop the curriculum for this program? So they just hired me as a consultant to develop the curriculum. And then when that got all approved, they said, okay, now we're hiring somebody to come get it started, and we want you. So I came out and I interviewed, and I just thought, oh my gosh, I'm walking into something that I feel like I could be at the front end of, have some real creativity, and still be able to write. It just seemed ideal to me. And that was 35 years ago, so I still feel like it's just ideal to me.
Well, let's transition now into the story behind the book. I actually finished listening to the audiobook of Talk to Me last night on my flight back from Orlando, and just reflecting on the whole book. It's part memoir, it's part textbook, and I'm always curious to hear kind of that genesis, that story of how a book gets its start after, how many decades you've been doing this. I get the sense that you were pregnant with, and this was kind of stewing and brewing inside of you. So why was this the right time for this book to come out? How did you know you'd reach kind of that right place of expertise and experience to be able to share this with the world?
I really feel like this was the result of an amazing editor, frankly. And your listeners, if they're authors, I'm hopeful that they will have had similar kinds of experiences where an editor or an agent or a publisher or somebody is saying, what if we tweak this idea and go this direction? And then you realize, oh my gosh, you are right. And that's exactly what happened with this one. This was not the book I had intended to write. This was not the book I wrote originally. I wanted to write a book after all of these years of being a journalist and of teaching journalism and teaching writing. I wanted to write a book about how to write better. I wanted to do my own William Zinsser on writing well. So I put together a manuscript and had this really, really solid outline, had a literary agent get really excited about it, and she sent it off to a bunch of publishers, and they all rejected it, every one of them, big and small, because they kept saying, we already have writing books. We already have Stephen King's On Writing. We already have Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. We already have Mary Karr's The Art of Memoir. We already have William Zinsser's On Writing Well. And they just said, we already have books about writing. But this one editor, the one from HarperCollins, put in a PS at the bottom of her thanks but no thanks letter. She said, I wonder if Dean would be interested in doing a book about interviewing. He seems to know something about it. So I got on the phone to her and we started brainstorming what that book would look like. And it's like bam, it all kind of coalesced in my mind and in her mind. And I sent her a new outline of what that interviewing book would look like. And she said, yep, that's the one we want. So I'm really grateful to this editor. Her name is Hannah Robinson from HarperCollins. And she's with Simon & Schuster now. But she's the one who saw this little glimpse of something else and said, let's develop that, because there isn't a lot written on that. And you've got some experience in it. So I'd love to tell you that I thought this whole thing through myself and said, this is the time for civil discourse. This is the time for honoring one another's stories. This is the time for a book about interviewing. I'd love to tell you it was my idea, but I responded to a really, really good insight from an editor.
As a publishing professional, I can vouch for that. To make a really great book, it sort of takes a village to raise that book up into adulthood and maturity. So it's almost always a group effort.
Yeah, and something that I was so narrow-mindedly focused on that said, I have some experience here. I have some good anecdotes about writing and about making writing better. And I've spoken at writing workshops all over the world and done training of writers all over the world, from India to Iceland to all over the U.S. But for her to pick up on something else and say, let's explore this, that just shows, as you said, it shows the value of community in creativity. The folks who just work in total isolation, I respect them and my hat's off to them, but that's not how I work.
Well, and I think there couldn't be a better time for this book to have released, because we're in this interesting time that between social media and blogs and podcasts and Facebook Live videos and whatnot, we're at this interesting intersection where we're all sort of journalists and interviewers right now. And like we talked about before the interview, some of it's amazing quality, some of it's awful. And this even applies to myself. You know, I've never been formally trained in any way, shape, or form to do interviews, yet for the past 8 years, I've interviewed more than 450 authors about books that they've produced. And so, like, I read this book and I was like, oh, wow, this would have been great 8-9 years ago. It would have helped me out a ton.
Yeah.
For you, as somebody who's spent much of your career in the sort of media/interview space, I'd love for you to just comment a bit about what's shifted and what's the landscape as you see it today. Maybe some of the needs of that landscape, if you will.
Well, everybody has access now to publish things and to post things. And as we see with that kind of availability, some of it is done really, really well. Some are just intuitively great at it. But I would say most people are not. And it's just painful to watch some of these interactions that we see or that we hear on podcasts or whatever. I listen to that and I just say, but this is a fixable thing. You can actually do some work. You can pick up on some of the steps in my book, and you can actually make this better. It would not take that much to make this better. And so I just think you're right that it's an unusual season. Well, I would say it's an unusual season for two reasons. One, just the proliferation of people's ability to get stuff out there. And so you have to separate yourself from the average or the below average, which is 99%, and to make yourself more interesting, more listenable, more provocative, to get past the surface and the cliches and the prepared statements. There's a way to do that, and it isn't that hard. You just have to put a little thought into it and a little preparation. But the other reason this is a perfect season for this kind of thing is that our ability to actually listen to one another it seems to be at an all-time low right now, where to just hear another person's story, especially someone you disagree with, and to do this in a civil way where we're actually interested in this other person's story, this other person's account. How do we do that in a healthy way where we can still disagree, but we haven't dishonored the person? We haven't insulted the person. We haven't mocked the person, but we actually, in a professional and in a healthy and in a life-giving way, we can still honor one another as human beings. Just that kind of discourse, this is a season that I think needs a book like this now more than ever.
Next, I'd love to have you talk to us a bit about what's key in terms of preparation. Now, the bulk of the work I've done has been focused mostly on books, so a lot of times I get a prepared press kit and I pitch my authors to different TV shows and podcasts and radio and whatnot. And I know probably 60, 70% of those shows, they never read the book. If you're lucky, they've skimmed the press kit. So that's kind of my world and the audience of people I help out. But in terms of preparation, like, what's appropriate? Can you ever be too prepared? I feel like more often than not, right now, people are underprepared. So what would proper preparation look like, regardless of the medium you're going to be releasing your content in?
And I would echo your point that most people are underprepared. And it's not that hard. It's not that hard to prepare. I go way overboard. I tend to overgather and over-prepare. So I do these writers' symposium interviews with Ray Bradbury or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Anne Lamott or Rob Bell or whomever, and I find out everything I possibly can about them. And I try to read as much of their stuff as I can. But not everybody has that kind of time. But if you want to make this so that you're going to set your time apart from everybody else's, you've got to go past Google. You've got to go past the press kit. And you've got to look into a person's background and read some of what they wrote early on. That's one of my favorite things to do, actually, is to read something that these people have wrote maybe way, way, way a long time ago and pull out a sentence or a nugget or something and say, back in 1987, you said this. Do you still think that way? Or have you evolved in your thinking? And that's just going to open up this whole evolution of thought and of development in this person's mind and spirit. So if you want to have this encounter that you're going to have with this person be something other than it's just going to fill 15 minutes or it's going to be a contractual obligation, then I just think you're obligated to read more than what the press kit has given you. No self-respecting journalist would just accept a news release by somebody and just rewrite that news release and call it a story. You've got to do some additional work on this thing. Otherwise, you're just kind of perpetuating propaganda or being part of a PR stunt. I don't think any of us really want to do that.
I want to be sensitive to my friends I know who are listening who are like, yeah, but this podcast, this thing, it's like the fifth thing on my list. And I get that. I mean, I've got 10 kids. I've got a more than full-time job. And so I do have to be very intentional to set aside the time. But my thing is if you are going to do a bunch of stuff and do a poor job of preparing, it's all going to be kind of low level, not all that great of quality. Right. When I have people who are doing that, I'm like, well, do fewer podcasts, do 3 a month and make them amazing. I'd rather see people invest in really high-end, great interviews and do fewer of them than do, 25 of them a month or something, and they're just all kind of garbage.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm really with you. You really want to do it well. How are you honoring the gifts you've been given if you do it all in just kind of a mushy, mediocre way? I think you're insulting the gifts and who gave you those gifts if you just try to cram all those things in. Here's a little practical thing that I've just started doing. I don't know how practical it is for your listeners, but on this front of preparation and not having time to prepare, every school is trying to offer internships to their students. And good practical internship experience would be to get some student to work with you just a couple hours a week and find out as much stuff as you possibly can. And then they highlight some things for you. And then they're like a reference librarian for you, where they actually save you a lot of time by pulling stuff out of books, out of journal articles, off the internet, off of podcasts or YouTube videos, and just give it to you in a more digested kind of way. And that may be a way to help you save time. It's minimum wage, or maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's just you're giving them college credit, but that might be a way to help you.
Well, and I actually have a good friend of mine, Jason Jones. Some of the folks listening will know him. He has his own literary PR company, and he's done this exact thing. He's partnered with a local college in his area in Nashville, and he brings on a couple of interns every semester, and they do kind of the behind-the-scenes research and busy work that he just doesn't have the time to do, but it really allows him to expand his capacity and help some kids, some college students who are interested in the PR world get some real
Right.
tangible hands-on job experience. It's a beautiful matchup.
It is. And some people think about it as just, kind of slave labor kind of stuff. And maybe it is, but it's actually practical. It gives the students practical experience. It gives them some college credit, and it saves you a ton of time.
Next, let's talk about the art of getting past gatekeepers, or maybe it might be better to say working with gatekeepers. And for those people that say no, what does it look like to be appropriately persistent?
Let's make it clear at first what we mean by gatekeepers. And let me just make this proclamation. Gatekeepers rule the world.
Amen.
They are the people in charge of the world. It's not the presidents and the CEOs who run the world. It's the people who protect the presidents and the CEOs. And so on the one hand, as a journalist, I used to think that they were just somebody that I had to either get around or shame into helping me or whatever. But the older I've gotten and the more I've done the journalism thing, the more I realize the gatekeepers are the key to whether you're going to have a good experience interviewing somebody or not. And what I mean by gatekeeper, it could be their public relations people, it could be their secretary, it could be an administrative assistant, it could be a colleague, whatever. You first have to deal with them before you can actually get to the person you're trying to talk to. And if you treat them in a demeaning, condescending, you're just sort of the parsley on the main course, you're going to pay a price for that. They can open doors, they can close doors. They can make this a good experience, they can make this a bad experience. So by being kind and human and civil to the people who actually control the schedules of the people you want to talk to, that's in your best interest. It's the right thing to do just as a human being anyway, but it's also expeditious professionally. That's the only way you're going to get to some of these folks. In my view, the way you do it is you have to convince these folks, A, that you're a human being, B, that you're just an authentic person who's looking for some good information for a good story, and C, that this is in this person's best interest. That's some of the preparation work that has to go into, even before you make the ask of trying to procure the interview. You have to be able to make that ask in such a way that it shows that this is in that person's best interest. So I think if you do that kind of thinking, that kind of work ahead of time, it's going to make your time with both the gatekeeper and the source herself or himself much more fruitful.
And I think in terms of all the interviews I've done, it's ridiculously easy to get an interview with somebody when they are promoting a product, a new book, a new album, a new film, whatever it might be. But sometimes if you want to get an interview and they're not promoting anything in particular at that point, that takes a different tactic, maybe even a different skill set. So I'd love to have you talk to us next about how do you convince somebody to talk to you when they're not actually wanting to promote something?
Yeah, I think when you approach someone from the perspective of they have a point of view on something that you're working on that is unique, that they have an expertise, that they can explain this, whatever this thing is that you're trying to do. On the one hand, you could say it's ego manipulation, it's flattery or whatever. That may be part of it, but it's also the truth that you actually need this person's perspective because that person has a unique skill set or experience or whatever to help you explain something. So one of the ways I've approached this with somebody who doesn't have something to promote, there's nothing really in it for them, I'll just say to them, I've got a problem and I hope you can help me solve it. And there are a lot of people who right there, they want to be helpful. And so if you approach it that way and then address their expertise, again, you got to be able to convince them that you know what you're talking about and why you're approaching them as experts. I think people are much more amenable to cooperating if you put it into that kind of a context of you just need their help and they're uniquely qualified to speak on a particular topic. Not everybody, but a lot of people want to share their story and want to share what they know. And really, if you can approach them as experts or explainers or something, that's where I think you're going to get better cooperation.
And one of the things I really loved about your book is It's a great mix of teaching, but you also have a lot of wonderful stories. Some of them are your own personal accounts. Some of them are accounts from other people's interview experiences. But, as I look back across the experience of reading the whole book, or listening to the whole book in my case, my favorite story had to do with your neighbor, the unemployed rocket scientist, and would love to have you share a little bit about that.
Sure.
And actually how you got interested in writing about him, because he wasn't somebody you would have normally sat down and really written anything about.
No, in fact, that's what made this story so much cooler. Had somebody approached me and said, "Hey, I've got this great story idea for you. Would you go do it?" I probably still would have done it. It might have come across differently than it did in this organic way. But we have these neighbors. They've moved away since because they've become quite wealthy, thanks in part to a story I did about them. But they were living in our neighborhood. They had kids my kids' age. We saw them at school functions, all that in elementary school. And they were, both he and his wife were scientists, but previously in the NASA program. And then they moved to a company in San Diego. And then that company closed down its space division. And these two people, this husband and wife, this father and mother, were laid off. They're both rocket scientists and they're both unemployed. And the neighbors kind of rallied around them because, they had 3 kids. And what do you do? San Diego's an expensive town to live in. So we were bringing them groceries and stuff and just trying to help look out for them. And one day I was at the schoolyard waiting for my kids to get out of elementary school. And this guy, the dad, was there to pick up his kids as well. And we just struck up a conversation. I asked him what he was doing, how he was spending his time. And he said, "Well, I'm working on a couple of inventions." Well, as a journalist, I'm just a curious person anyway. So that kind of perked me up. And I said, "Well, what are you working on?" And he said, "Well, I'll show you on the way home if you want to see it." So I'm with my kids. He's with his kids. We walk back to his house. He opens up the garage. And on his workbench, I don't know if you've ever seen the album cover of the old Beatles album. It's called the Butcher cover. It's got all of these dolls that are just chopped up and they're just covered in blood. And it's just this really gory scene. It was never sold in the U.S., but that's what I thought of was, oh, this is like the Butcher cover. This is just limbs of dolls strewn all over this workbench. There's no blood, thankfully. But he said, "I'm working on something that will make a doll cry intermittently so that you can kind of train people a little bit better on what it's like to have a baby in the house." So he's thinking like health classes and things like that, high schools, any kind of parenting classes. And he said, "I'll give you an example." So we had this microchip that he had taken one of his daughter's dolls apart, and he turned on this crying sound. Turned out he had recorded his own daughter crying, and it was just the most horrible screeching and wailing and all that. And he said, "And not until you hold the baby in this sort of feeding position for a few seconds will that cry stop." He said, "That's what it's like to have a baby in the house." And I just thought, this is awesome. And so I said, "Thanks for showing me." And I got to thinking about it, and I thought, oh, this is a story. So I went back to him and I said, "Who has seen this?" And he said, "Well, it's at a couple of health classes in some high schools in San Diego and a couple of parenting clinics." So I just asked him, I said, "Do you mind if I try to pursue this as a story?" And yeah, he said, "Fine." So I talked to some of the teenage girls who had brought this doll home with them, and this thing just starts shrieking at these random times. So it's not like they could just put the baby away and go to the movies or something. It monitors how long the baby cries, how roughly it was handled, all that. So I interviewed those girls. I interviewed the people running the health classes, went back and interviewed the rocket scientist again, and put together a story. What I thought was interesting, he wasn't trying to address a social problem of teenage pregnancy. He was just trying to come up with something that would feed his family. And as it turned out, it addressed a huge social problem. So I did a story for the New York Times about it. And the next morning, the morning that that edition came out, the block in front of his house was completely filled with news satellite trucks, reporters. Everybody in the world had come down from LA and just descended on this guy's house because this was just such an amazing kind of invention. And he started a company. Back then he called it Baby Think It Over. And it was this wildly, wildly successful product of teaching people what it's like to have a baby in your house without actually having a baby in your house.
Well, that's a perfect early illustration of something going viral in that day and age.
Yeah, and this was before social media, so just think of what this would have been like if I would have shot some video of him and his workbench, anything like that. It would have happened within minutes as opposed to the day that the New York Times came out. But this was your classic viral before there was viral. So maybe it was bacterial. I don't know.
And I love that the original company name was Baby Think It Over. That would probably not be received as well as a company or product name today. They're like, that's a little too negative.
Yeah, exactly. and they ended up developing all of these different kinds of screaming dolls. One was a crack baby, so it had a completely different kind of cry, and the baby would tremble, like crazy, and was never consoled or comforted. That was the thing that they were trying to communicate of, if you're doing crack when you're pregnant, this is the kind of baby you're going to produce. So, it was kind of remarkable.
Next, let's talk about what the Olympics can teach us about asking better questions. I think this is another favorite part of the book where you said, you don't normally yell at the TV, but when it's Olympics time, you make an exception and yell away.
Oh my gosh. I lose my voice. I yell so much at my television during the Olympics because I just think, seriously, think about this. Somebody has worked most of his or her life, or at least for the last 4 years, trying to perfect one thing, something on the balance beam or a butterfly stroke in the swimming pool or a snowboarding stunt or whatever. They have spent much of their lives, broken many bones, bankrupted their entire families, and they get at the end of the event, and the best that the reporter can ask is, how does it feel? It's incomprehensible to me that that's the best question you could possibly ask. Because we all know you can't describe how this feels. This is the culmination of a person's adolescence and professional life, and all of their hopes and dreams have come together for this moment. And you want them in 15 seconds to say, how does this feel? Oh my gosh. It's just the laziest question you could possibly ask. Shaun, I'm going to anticipate your next question, which is, so what should they ask? Am I right?
Yes, Dean, if you were out there on the, I don't even know if you call it red carpet for the Olympics, I guess the place where they're standing on the different level of boxes to show who was, gold and silver and bronze. If you were in that reporter's shoes, Dean, how would you do it properly?
Well, I think you've got some options, but you have to be fairly quick on your feet to be able to do this. But depending on the event, I think you could ask, what was the moment where you thought, I've got it? I've totally got it. So if you're doing some snowboard thing and you're upside down 30 feet in the air, you could ask that athlete, did you know you had that jump nailed at that point? Or when did you know this was going to be it? And describe how the rest of the race went. I just think that would give you an insight into the mind and the commitment and the psychology of being somebody at that level. Or if you've done your backgrounding enough, you're going to know that something happened maybe during the training that was potentially catastrophic or something that was super inspiring. And so, I think you could get something out of this interview at the very end of a race and say, hey, take us back to that time in the training room where you thought you had fractured your pelvis and thought, am I ever going to compete again? And now you're here. Compare those two feelings for me. And you're just going to get something personal. You're going to get that person's personality. You're going to find something about the human spirit. But, oh my gosh, how does it feel to win the gold medal? Are you kidding me? How long have the Olympics been going on? Since the Greeks? And that's still the best question we can come up with? Oh my gosh, come on. We've evolved more as a species than that.
I kind of feel like that how do you feel question is sort of the equivalent of just using the canned press questions that you received. And to some extent, I've written my share of press kits through the years and use some of the questions, but please don't use all of the questions. Have some creativity, do some research, and come up with something a little bit better.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, a lot of the times you're asking these questions, what they're actually getting at is how do you feel? But you're not asking it in such a broad way that they're trying to hang language on something that is impossible to describe.
On the one hand, with how you described the question you would ask, you're drawing the viewer, the listener, the reader, what have you, into the experience, but you're also getting more into the humanity of it, and it's making it more experiential and relatable. And also, if I just ask somebody how they feel, they would say, well, I just won the gold medal. I feel great. Okay, well, now what? Next question, and where do you go?
Yeah, exactly. What have we learned about this athlete when they say, I feel great? We haven't learned anything. We haven't learned anything about that athlete. We haven't learned anything about human achievement or commitment or no. Sometimes I even throw things. I don't just yell stuff at my TV. Sometimes I throw things at it because I get so frustrated with that question.
Remind me not to come over to your house during the Olympics. It sounds like a loud and violent time.
Or after I win some great award. Shaun, don't call me up and say, how does it feel?
Yeah. I'll add some Google searches for your name just so I can do that very thing. Next, let's talk about, and I won't say this is one of my pet peeves, but one of the things I face that's a challenge from time to time is, what do you do when a guest takes control or tries to seize control of an interview? Because on the one hand, depending on the guest from a respect standpoint, if they're a really big deal, or if they're older, I find it when you're talking to people who are sometimes in their 70s and 80s, they can tend to ramble a lot. And so sometimes out of a respect, I will just let them go. And when we reach a natural pause point, I may redirect. So I might not be as likely to try to regain control in that situation, but by and large, people can tend to wander and go off on a tangent. So what have you found through the years that is a successful way to tactfully deal with guests who try to seize control?
Yeah, I think as awkward as it may feel to regain control of the interview, you just absolutely must do it. You must. It's your job. You're the interviewer. This is your show. So I've had some people that I've interviewed, if I just say, hey, I just need 15 minutes of your time. Could I just get 15 minutes of your time? And I start asking them a question, and then they ramble on. I know that they're just running out the clock. I just know that. I think there's a respectful way to just, by using body language, if you're in person, hold up your hands. I think ultimately you have to cut them off and just say, hang on. I know that I asked you for just 15 minutes and we're already at minute 7 and I've got a couple more questions. Can I go ahead and ask those questions? I just think you have to. So there are some people who are savvy enough that they're going to try to control it and own it and not let you get in what you're trying to get in. But I think most people just don't know when to shut it down when they start talking, especially, and this is going to sound terribly ageist or stereotypical, but I'm basing this on observing my parents and people my parents' age. When they get talking, they can't find the off switch. They just start rambling. And my observation is they're actually relieved when you either just pat them on the arm in a non-condescending way and just, hang on, we're kind of getting off. We lost the thread here. Let's come back to the topic. They're grateful because sometimes when people are talking, they're actually looking for the thread too. How did they get off on this? So I think you're doing your listeners a disservice if you let somebody just keep going. And there's a respectful, non-intrusive, non-threatening way to just cut them off and just say, sir, hang on one second. You're getting into some territory that's really interesting, but that's not what I was hoping to get at for this question. Maybe we could come back to that and then reframe your question, and then they're back with you. Your listeners are going to thank you for it, and I think your sources are going to thank you for it.
Well, next let's transition into what should we do when an interview begins to go south. In the book, I think my favorite part in the latter section of the book was the NPR interview with Gene Simmons, and that was a fascinating, fascinating journey.
What a train wreck that was.
But, what's an interviewer to do when things start going bad?
Well, in that case, it was Gene Simmons of KISS was being interviewed by Terry Gross of NPR, the Fresh Air program. And she's a superb interviewer. And I have to confess, I felt a little badly that out of all the magnificent interviews she's done, I just pull out the one that was just a train wreck. But it's so instructive in that if you look at the transcript of the interview, which I provide in the book, you can see where it went off the rails because she got thrown off and a little insulted early on in that interview, and she never actually recovered. And there's one other thing that if you read the transcript of it, you realize that she never got past her initial question. She kept asking him about his makeup. That isn't what we want to talk about with Gene Simmons. It was just sort of a way to get into the conversation, but she kept coming back to it. So she kind of went into a brain lock and kept going back to that particular question, and he just kept making it worse and worse and worse. So you can see in that transcript where it went badly. But if you're in an interview and you can feel it go badly, I think you've got a couple of options. If you're doing a podcast like yours, or if you're doing something like a Fresh Air program or whatever, you can actually stop it. You can just say, hang on, we're going to stop recording here just for a second. Let's reframe this and let's get back on track. You can do that. And then everybody takes a deep breath, you drink some water, and then we kind of hit a reset button. If it's live, like another one of the interviews that I show or that I deconstruct, like one between Bill Clinton and Chris Wallace of Fox News, then it's this kind of give and take of I'm trying to regain control of this interview. And I just thought that was a clinic in both people trying to control the interview and take it away from each other. But you've got to be thinking on the fly. It's a high wire act. You've got to be thinking about your next questions, and you've also got to be thinking about how do I cut this answer off, and how do I do a follow-up question, and how do I challenge something that's not true? All of that. You've got to bring your A game for those kinds of interviews.
Another part of the book that was really kind of intriguing to me, and I'd never thought about this before, was legal issues. So working in the publishing space in terms of if somebody's interviewed for a book or we're going to share their story, more often than not, we're getting them to sign a release so we can use their story or their quote, whatever it might be in a book. But in terms of podcasting, I'm thinking, man, I've interviewed in the next 6 months, I'll pass the 500 mark, and I've never gotten a release for anything. And so I think a lot of us who are just decide one day I'm going to have a show on Facebook Live or have a podcast, we're not ever thinking about any legal ramifications. And I've not heard a lot of stories of podcasters being sued. And to this point, I'm sure there are some examples out there. But I guess at a broad level, when it comes to dotting our I's, crossing our T's, and just, doing a good job of keeping notes and keeping records, whether it's somebody doing a video show or a podcast or whatnot, what would be some good rules of thumb that would apply in that space as well as, say, writing a story that might be for online or in-print consumption?
Well, I think for podcasters, there's sort of a tacit agreement that if I'm going to go on your podcast, I'm giving you the right to broadcast it. You didn't ask me to sign away any kind of legal rights or anything. You just invited me on your show and I agreed to it. So I know what a podcast is. By agreeing to the interview, I'm giving you permission to use it. If I were to say, I will agree to this interview, but I need to hear it or I need to see the transcript before you can post it, I probably have the right to do that because I might be afraid that I say something that's going to be offensive to someone or hurt my own reputation or something like that. So I think there are those considerations. But when somebody agrees to go on your podcast, they're agreeing to let you use it. Where I think a lot of video and audio people get in trouble is if they edit a conversation to a point where it distorts or changes the meaning of what the person said. And there have been all sorts of legal cases where it was the editing that was actually the problem, and where a different question gets spliced in front of what the person actually said. So the person actually said it, but they're answering a question different from the one that you're posting that they're answering. And that's legally problematic. That's a distortion, and you got to be careful. Editing is an exercise in truth-telling and can get you in just as much trouble legally as libel or slander or invasion of privacy or false light or any of those legal issues.
At the time of this recording, the book's been out for about 10 months. And for those of you listening who work in the publishing space, you understand that, a book is written often 18 to 24 months, or at least started that long before a book tends to go into print. I'm curious for you, Dean, looking back, it's been out for almost a year. I'm guessing you likely wrote this at least 2 years or more ago. Is there anything else you would add today that you didn't include in the original manuscript, or based on feedback, anything that you feel may have been missing in the book?
I love this question because really ideas are constantly moving and evolving and changing. I think right now, as I look at what's in there, I'm still comfortable that the points that I made are still valid for today. And so I don't think there would be a major thing that I would change. I might change an anecdote here or there, but I'm fairly confident that the point about preparing and honoring the other person and listening to another person's story and all of the different pieces that go into having an effective interview, I think those are still valid points. There's one anecdote of I just interviewed someone on the phone, a very famous person on the phone just 2 days ago, and there's no way I can name this person, but I am convinced she was in the bathtub as I was interviewing her. It was a phone interview. And just to describe kind of how distracting that was to me as I was trying to ask her questions, that would just be an amusing thing to include. So I think if I were to write it again, I might have some additional anecdotes, but I think the points that I'm making in there are still valid, and I think they still work.
One of the last things I wanted you to comment on, Dean, was your Writers' Symposium by the Sea. I would love to have you just share a little bit about what that is for those that might not be familiar, and also talk to us about what's motivated you to pursue this year after year. I would imagine it's a bit of work to put this on every year. Is there a certain curiosity factor? Is it the storytelling aspect of choosing interesting people and helping to tell their stories? Like, what is it, and what's driven you to keep doing that for many years?
Thanks for asking. The Writers' Symposium by the Sea, it's at the school where I teach, Point Loma and Nazarene University in San Diego. We do it every February. We're about to do our 25th year, and this year we have Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, as well as a number of other things. Sonia Nazario, she wrote a book that was made into a movie called Enrique's Journey. Pico Iyer, probably the most famous and gifted travel writer. We're bringing him in from Japan. But what the Writers' Symposium does is it's just really vivid conversation with great writers about writing. So it celebrates not only their work, but it also celebrates what it means to write well. And it kind of models and showcases great writing. And it says to the community and says to students or whomever, aspire to this. We bring in writers who have a body of work. It could be screenwriters, songwriters, filmmakers, novelists, journalists, whomever. It's been all over the place. Ray Bradbury, Amy Tan. We had one of the guys who was in the old band Buffalo Springfield. We've had filmmakers. So anyway, we bring these people out, and then we just have conversation with them about writing. So Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for instance, not a lot of people know he's a great writer. But the way I approached him was I wrote to him and said, I want you to come to this event we're doing at my school. We're not even going to talk about basketball. We want to talk about you as a writer. And that's what intrigued him. That's what made him want to come, because not that many people know that he writes well. So we do this every year. I do these sit-down interviews in front of an audience, and we talk about that writer's work, and we talk about the craft of writing, and we talk about how to become a better writer. And the reason I think it's so important is that we're a storytelling species. The human beings are storytellers. That's what sets us apart from other animals. And this is how we understand the world. It's how we understand ourselves. It's how we understand our place, our origin, is through story. And so to have these really lively, intelligent conversations about story and storytelling from all of these different perspectives of these writers who have done this for years and years, it's just a very moving and invigorating and inspiring kind of time. So it's coming up February 25, 26, and 27 of 2020, and it's our 25th year. If people want to check it out, they can go to the website, which is pointloma, pointloma.edu/writers. It'll be great fun. We had a podcaster. I just want you to know this, Shaun. We had a podcaster 2 years ago, Krista Tippett, another Minnesotan, who does the On Being podcast on public radio. She was magnificent, by the way. So we'd love to have you come out.
Well, and one of the things that has fascinated me through the years with Krista's podcast, and I don't know if she still does this anymore, it's been a while, but at one point, and this is if I remember correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, but they would release unedited versions of their show and then do the cleaned up version, which I thought was really, really fascinating. Because as a podcaster, I would struggle to not just release the cleaned up version.
And I think it's actually a brilliant move. I don't know if they still do it either, but it was a brilliant move on her part just to show transparency. It's sort of like with a movie, you can watch a director's cut as opposed to the one that was released for the masses, and you can see what else they had.
Right.
And the people who are really, really interested in that topic or that person or whatever, it's almost like they get a little bonus in there by hearing that additional information. But it's also a way for Krista Tippett's group, the On Being group, to say, we didn't distort this. We might have edited it. We might have truncated it a little bit to clean it up, but we didn't distort it. And here's proof. So props to them.
And in terms of the previous interviews from Writer Symposium by the Sea, are the majority of those available for watching on YouTube?
Yeah, they are. You can either just go on YouTube or just Google Writers Symposium by the Sea, and you'll see these broadcasts. They're broadcast by the University of California, San Diego. So UCSD comes out every year and broadcasts these interviews and then posts them. We've had more than 4 million downloads or views of the interviews. Or you can go to my website, where I've got ones that aren't just the Writers Symposium, but other religious leaders, other authors that I've done at other events. And my website is deannelson.net. There's a tab on there that says Interviews with Writers, and you can just click on that tab. You can see more than 20 years worth of interviews with really some of the great writers in the country.
Well, and Dean, you beat me to my next question, which was going to be, where can the listeners go online to connect with you and find out more? And as Dean said, that's deannelson.net. Like we do with every episode, we'll include detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Dean on his website, places where you can pick up your own copy of the book, and also include some links to the Writers Symposium by the Sea as well. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Dean Nelson. Once again, our book today was Talk to Me, How to Ask Better Questions, Get Better Answers, and Interview Anyone Like a Pro. For more on Dean and the book, a great place to start is his website. Once again, you can check that out over at deannelson.net. And Dean, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Shaun, it was great fun for me too. And let me just tell you, you asked great questions. Good job.